From whispered names in prison corridors to full-blown headlines that shook entire communities, these black women have left their mark on American prison history to be feared, infamous, or unforgettable. Some ruled cell blocks with an iron will, while others carried out crimes so brutal they became legends of true crime. And for a few, the fear they inspired wasn't just about the acts they committed, but the systems they dared to challenge. Behind every mugshot is a deeper story of violence, survival, manipulation, and sometimes chilling indifference. These aren't just tales of murder. These are the most feared black women in American prison history. Kimberly LaGale McCarthy. State, Texas. Prison facility, Mountain View Unit, Gatesville, Texas. Kimberly McCarthy was not someone society would have expected to turn into a cold-blooded killer. A former occupational therapist, McCarthy once lived a seemingly stable life, working in healthcare and helping others recover from physical challenges. However, her descent into crack cocaine addiction derailed everything. The drug dependency clouded her judgment and slowly pulled her deeper into a life of desperation and petty crime. But that desperation eventually evolved into something darker, something lethal. On July 21, 1997, McCarthy approached her 71-year-old neighbor, Dorothy Booth, under the pretense of borrowing a cup of sugar. Booth, a kind-hearted retired professor who had once taught psychology at a nearby college, welcomed her in. It was a decision that would cost her life. Once inside the home, McCarthy turned on Booth with terrifying violence. She stabbed the elderly woman multiple times with a butcher knife, beat her with a heavy candelabrum, and ultimately severed her ring finger in order to steal her diamond wedding ring. The level of brutality shocked both investigators and the community. This wasn't just a drug-fueled robbery gone wrong. It was a calculated and gruesome act of murder. McCarthy then stole Booth's car and several personal belongings, including credit cards, which she would later use to feed her addiction. The randomness of the attack, combined with the personal violation of removing Booth's ring finger, revealed a deeply disturbed state of mind that haunted everyone who had encountered the case. In the days that followed, McCarthy's behavior showed no signs of remorse. She sold the stolen items, including the wedding ring, and purchased crack cocaine almost immediately after the murder. Her indifference to the violence she had inflicted, coupled with the cold logic of her post-crime behavior, led investigators and prosecutors to suspect that wasn't her first time. Their suspicions were bolstered when forensic evidence linked her to the unsolved murders of two elderly women in 1998, Jetty Lucas and Maggie Harding. Both women had died in their homes, having been bludgeoned and stabbed in remarkably similar fashion. Though she was never charged in those two deaths, prosecutors introduced the evidence during her trial to establish a pattern of behavior. To many, this indicated that McCarthy was not just a woman driven to kill once by addiction, but potentially a serial predator who had eluded justice for years. Kimberly McCarthy was first sentenced to death in 1998, but the conviction was overturned due to issues with how her confession was obtained. She was retried in the year 2002, convicted again, and once more sentenced to death. She spent over a decade on death row at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, known for housing the state's female death row inmates. Her execution was delayed several times due to appeals, but it ultimately moved forward on June 26, 2013. As she was strapped to the gurney, she offered a brief apology to Booth's family before receiving a lethal injection. Her death marked a significant milestone in Texas history. Mitchell Blair. State, Michigan. Prison facility, Huron Valley Correctional Facility for Women, Ypsilanti, Michigan. Mitchell Blair's case stands out as one of the most horrifying and unforgettable crimes in recent American history. On the surface, Blair appeared to be a struggling single mother living in a cramped Detroit apartment with her 4 children. But what police discovered in her home on March the 24th, 2015, would reveal a nightmare beyond anyone's comprehension. While attempting to evict Blair from her residence for unpaid rent, court officers opened a deep freezer in the living room, and inside they found the frozen bodies of 2 children, 13-year-old Stoney Ann Blair and 9-year-old Stephen Gage Berry. Both children had been dead for years, Stoney since 2013 and Stephen since 2012, both hidden away in plain sight, while Blair continued living with her 2 surviving children. The horror of what happened to the deceased children became even more disturbing once Blair spoke. During court proceedings, she gave an unflinching, remorseless confession, calmly detailing how she murdered Stephen by punching, burning, and eventually suffocating him with a plastic bag. She claimed she killed him because he had allegedly abused his younger brother. A year later, she said she murdered Stoney after accusing her of doing the same to her younger sibling. Blair beat, starved, and tortured her daughter before killing her. What shocked the courtroom wasn't just her matter-of-fact tone, but the way she expressed pride in what she had done and insisted she would do it all over again and that she had no regrets whatsoever. Mitchell Blair's disturbing statements continued to draw national attention. In interviews and during sentencing, she displayed a chilling lack of empathy and emotional detachment. She claimed to be protecting her youngest child, and despite prosecutors and child psychologists presenting evidence that contradicted her claims, she remained steadfast in her justification. The state chose not to pursue the death penalty as Michigan abolished capital punishment long ago, but the court handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Blair waived her right to a trial and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She was also found guilty of child abuse, torture, and concealing a death. Her demeanor throughout the process was cold, combative, and unapologetic, and left a deep impact on everyone who watched. Now housed at the Huron Valley Correctional Facility for Women, Blair remains one of the most reviled inmates in Michigan's prison system. Inmates and staff alike are aware of the gruesome details of her case. Her crimes weren't just violent, they were calculated, drawn out, and committed against her own children in a setting meant to be safe. In prison lore, Mitchell Blair is not just feared for what she did, but for how willingly and unremorsefully she did it. Wanda Jean Allen. State, Oklahoma. Prison Facility, Mabel Bassett Correctional Center, McLeod, Oklahoma. Wanda Jean Allen became the first Black woman to be executed in the United States in the 21st century, and her case stirred national debate about race, mental health, and capital punishment. Born into poverty in Oklahoma City, Allen had a troubled upbringing and a documented intellectual disability stemming from a childhood brain injury. Despite these challenges, she was convicted in 1981 of manslaughter for the shooting death of a roommate. She served only a few years in prison and was released only to later commit an even more tragic and personal act of violence. In 1988, Allen fatally shot her girlfriend, Gloria Leathers, outside the Oklahoma City police station. The two women had a volatile and abusive relationship, marked by intense arguments and repeated physical altercations. On the day of the murder, they had fought inside their home before going to the police station so Leathers could file a complaint. After leaving the station in a moment of rage, Wanda Jean shot Leathers in the parking lot right outside, where officers could hear the gunfire. Leathers died shortly after, and Allen was immediately arrested. During her trial, prosecutors painted Allen as a remorseless killer who had escalated from her earlier manslaughter case. Her defense attorneys, however, argued that her intellectual limitations and past trauma had never been adequately addressed. They claimed she did not receive proper representation and that mitigating factors such as her mental state and abusive relationship were not fully explored in court. Despite these arguments and calls from activists, the court sentenced her to death in 1989. Over the next decade, her appeals were denied, even as human rights groups raised concerns about her mental capacity and the fairness of the trial. On January 11, 2001, Wanda Jean Allen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. Her last words were a quiet prayer and a message of peace to the Leathers family. Though she died quietly, her name lives on in legal discussions about executing people with intellectual disabilities and the lack of protections for LGBTQ women in abusive relationships. Safiya Bukhari. State, Virginia. Prison facility, Virginia Correctional Center for Women, Goochland. In the mid-1970s, Safiya Bukhari became one of the most watched and feared women in Virginia's prison system, not because of violence she committed behind bars, but because of her relentless organizing, radical politics, and refusal to be broken by the system. A former biology student who became involved with the Black Panther Party, Bukhari later joined the Black Liberation Army, which was labeled a domestic terrorist organization by the FBI during the COINTELPRO era. She was convicted on weapons possession charges after a standoff involving BLA members and was sentenced to several years in prison. Once inside the Virginia Correctional Center for Women, Safiya didn't lay low. Instead, she built a reputation for challenging authority, exposing abuse, and leading fellow inmates in resistance. She filed legal complaints against prison officials, held educational sessions with other incarcerated women, and refused to conform to the rules that sought to erase her political identity. Guards referred to her as disruptive and a security threat, while fellow inmates saw her as a symbol of strength and a protector of their rights. Her influence was so significant that prison officials labeled her as one of the most dangerous women in their custody, though she never physically harmed anyone. Bukhari spent time in solitary confinement as a punishment for her defiance, yet she continued to speak out. She was instrumental in forming support networks that advocated for political prisoners and campaigned against abuse and racial discrimination within prison walls. Even after her release on parole in 1983, Bukhari remained active, co-founding the Jericho Movement, an organization that fights for the recognition and release of U.S. political prisoners, especially Black revolutionaries. Her post-prison work brought further attention to the systemic silencing of women like herself. Though Safiya Bukhari passed away in 2003, her legacy still echoes in both activist and prison reform circles. She was feared by the system not for violence, but for the power of her ideas, her defiance, and her ability to galvanize resistance inside one of the most controlled environments in America. She remains one of the most revered and feared political prisoners in U.S. women's prison history. Linda Taylor. State, Illinois. Prison facility, Dwight Correctional Center, now closed. Born as Martha Louise White in 1926 Tennessee, Linda Taylor didn't just dabble in crime, she turned it into a lifestyle. With a Black mother and racially mixed background, she grew up in an America where skin color defined opportunity. By the 1950s and 60s, Linda was already building an underground empire of identities. She changed her appearance, forged documents, and created imaginary families just to cheat the system. By the late 60s, she had over 80 aliases, using them to pull off fraud after fraud, welfare, social security, and even tax scams, leaving a trail so tangled It took investigators years to unravel. Her big spotlight came in 1974, when Chicago officials finally caught up with her. She was arrested for running a scheme that had her collecting what would now be more than $150,000 in stolen public assistance. But what really catapulted her into national infamy was politics. Ronald Reagan, during his presidential run, made her the poster woman for government abuse, dubbing her the welfare queen. In 1977, Linda was found guilty of welfare fraud and perjury and sentenced to 2 to 6 years at the Dwight Correctional Center in Illinois. But there was a lot more to Linda's story than fraud. Digging deeper, investigators linked her to multiple kidnappings, including the 1957 abduction of a baby from a Chicago hospital. She'd taken custody of kids who weren't hers, all part of the con to boost her welfare claims. Even more chilling, she was tied to the suspicious deaths of elderly people, one of whom she tried to cash in on through a life insurance scam. She was never officially charged with murder, but one prosecutor famously said she was capable of anything, and the trail she left behind backed that up. In prison, Linda didn't stop being Linda. At Dwight, she had a reputation for being manipulative and sharp, someone who always had a plan and could twist people to get her way. She ended up serving less than 3 years and was released in the early 1980s. She kept a low profile until her death in 2002, but her full story didn't come to light until a deep investigation in 2013 finally connected the dots. Linda Taylor wasn't just feared for what she did, but how effortlessly she played every system she touched. From the courtroom to the cell block, she left behind a legacy of quiet chaos that still baffles people today. Josephine the Black Widow Gray. State, Maryland. Prison facility, federal custody after 2002 conviction. Josephine Gray's life was marked by a trail of mysterious deaths that always seemed to benefit her in the end. Her first husband, Norman Stribling, was found dead in 1974, and not long after, her second husband, William Robert Gray, died in 1990 under suspicious circumstances. Then, in 1996, her boyfriend Clarence Good was killed, again with details that raised more questions than answers. Though she was never officially charged with any of the murders, prosecutors were convinced Josephine was no innocent bystander. They believed she played a role in each death, sometimes even recruiting others to help carry them out. People around her spoke of fear and intimidation, saying she didn't just manipulate people with words or lies, but with something much deeper, which is a reputation for using voodoo to scare those who got too close to the truth. It didn't take long for her to earn the nickname the Black Widow. By the time authorities realized how much danger lingered around Josephine, the legal trail for murder had gone cold. Witnesses had vanished, changed stories, or refused to speak. Investigators knew the fear she cast wasn't just rumor, it was real, and it worked. But in 2002, the government decided to come at her a different way. Instead of murder, they went after the money. She had collected over $160,000 in life insurance payouts linked to the deaths of those same men. With solid paper trails and fraudulent documentation, Josephine was finally convicted of mail and wire fraud. Even without murder charges, the court saw through her pattern of manipulation, and she was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. What made Josephine so deeply feared wasn't brute strength. It was the way she controlled people's minds. Court records painted her as a woman who thrived on fear, using rituals, black magic, and spiritual threats to keep others silent. Several people claim she used voodoo dolls, chants, and dark spiritual warnings to terrify both friends and foes. Her own family members were afraid to speak out, believing they'd be cursed or harmed if they crossed her. Even now, Josephine Gray remains behind bars, serving her time quietly but with a legacy that still casts a shadow. She never faced a courtroom over the murders that followed her like ghosts, but her story remains one of the most chilling examples of a woman who weaponized both manipulation and myth. She's remembered not just for the lives that ended in her wake, but for how she bent fear to her will, creating a reputation that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears her name. Priscilla Joyce Ford, State, Nevada. Prison facility, Florence McClure, Women's Correctional Center, Nevada, formerly Southern Nevada Women's Correctional Facility. On Thanksgiving Day, 1980, the city of Reno, Nevada, witnessed one of the most shocking acts of mass violence committed by a woman in U.S. history. Priscilla Joyce Ford, a 51-year-old former schoolteacher, deliberately plowed her Lincoln Continental through a crowded street filled with holiday shoppers. She killed 6 people instantly and injured 23 others, some critically. Witnesses described the car as accelerating while bodies were thrown into the air. It was later revealed that Ford had looped around the block specifically to gain momentum before the impact, a detail that emphasized the intentional nature of her attack. Ford had a documented history of severe mental illness, including paranoid schizophrenia, and had been institutionalized several times prior to the incident. Despite these red flags, she was released and left unsupervised. On that fateful day, she was reportedly muttering religious statements, claiming she was the reincarnation of Jesus and had to cleanse the sins of the earth. Her rampage came out of nowhere, and the randomness of the attack instilled deep fear not only in Reno but across the country as the public grappled with the idea that such an atrocity could come from a seemingly unthreatening woman in her 50s. During her trial, Ford exhibited erratic behavior and showed little remorse. She openly admitted to the killings and stated she wished she could have killed more. Despite her defense attorney's attempt to plead insanity, the jury found her guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to death in 1982. Her sentencing made her the only woman on Nevada's death row for decades, and one of the few black women in the U.S. to ever receive a capital punishment verdict for mass murder. Priscilla Ford remained on death row at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center until her death from emphysema on January 29, 2005. She never faced execution, but her actions left an unshakable legacy. Her calm demeanor during interviews and court appearances, contrasted with the horror she unleashed, contributed to her chilling reputation. Ford's case is still remembered today, not just for the tragic loss of life, but for how it shattered expectations of what violence looks like. She remains one of the most feared and notorious black women in the history of the American justice system. Antoinette Frank. State, Louisiana. Prison facility, Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. Antoinette Frank was once a New Orleans police officer, sworn to serve and protect. But by March 4, 1995, she would become one of the most despised figures in Louisiana law enforcement history. On that night, Frank and her accomplice, her boyfriend, Roger Lacaze, a known drug dealer, entered a Vietnamese-owned restaurant called Kim An, where she had previously worked off-duty as a security guard. Inside were the owners and their children, as well as Officer Ronald A. Williams II, Frank's partner on the force. In an act of cold betrayal, Frank and Lacaze robbed the place and fatally shot Officer Williams, followed by the execution-style killing of 2 of the owner's children, Ha and Quang Vu. The motive? A combination of greed, desperation, and a disturbing descent into criminal behavior. What made the crime even more shocking was Frank's badge. She was still in uniform when the massacre took place. After killing her fellow officer and the Vu siblings, She casually returned to the crime scene, playing the part of the responder, hoping to deflect suspicion from her. But one of the surviving Vu family members, Chuang Vu, had witnessed the entire ordeal while hiding in a freezer. He later identified Frank as one of the shooters, unraveling her entire charade. The community and the New Orleans Police Department were rocked. A trusted officer had abused her power to commit a crime that violated every principle she was meant to uphold. During her trial, prosecutors painted Frank as manipulative, cold, and void of remorse. Her own colleagues testified that she had a history of erratic behavior, falsified documents during her application process, and was not fit to wear a badge. Jurors were shown crime scene photos and heard heart-wrenching testimony from surviving family members. The evidence against her, which were ballistics, eyewitness testimony, and her failed attempts at deception, was overwhelming. In 1995, she was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, making her one of the few women on Louisiana's death row. Antoinette Frank currently remains incarcerated at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, awaiting execution. Her case continues to haunt both law enforcement and criminal justice discussions across the country. Her story is often cited as one of the darkest betrayals in U.S. policing history. While not physically intimidating in appearance, Frank is feared for her cold-blooded betrayal of the badge and for embodying how power in the wrong hands can turn really deadly. Malaika Tamu Griffin, State, Colorado. Prison Facility, Denver Women's Correctional Facility, Colorado. On May 18, 1999, what started as a petty argument turned into something deadly. Malaika Griffin got into a heated dispute with her neighbor, Jason Horsley, after he left his tools on the sidewalk in front of her home. That small incident escalated fast. She stormed back into her apartment, picked up a 9mm handgun fitted with a laser sight, and walked right back out to confront him. Then, at close range, she shot him once in the back and then again in the head, killing him. Instead of staying, she ran. She carjacked someone she knew at gunpoint and disappeared without a trace, kicking off a nationwide manhunt that lasted a staggering 6 years. For years, Malaika managed to stay under the radar. She changed her name to Leek Griffin and altered her appearance, blending into new surroundings without raising suspicion, but her past eventually caught up with her. In June 2005, some old co-workers in El Cajon, California, recognized her and tipped off the authorities. She was finally arrested and brought back to Denver to face justice. When investigators searched her old apartment, they found something chilling: a stash of weapons, hand grenades, and copies of extremist books, including the Anarchist Cookbook. She had also written a personal manifesto full of rage and hate, unknowingly handing prosecutors even more ammunition against her. In 2006, Malaika Griffin stood trial. It didn't take long for the jury to convict her on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated robbery, and car theft. Her own diary entries revealed how deeply rooted her hatred was, especially towards white people. The prosecution laid out the cold, calculated way she had rigged weapons and plotted her moves. There was strong DNA evidence damning testimony and her own words. After a short trial, the jury sentenced her to life in prison with no chance of parole. Today, Malaika is locked up at the Denver Women's Correctional Facility. Her story isn't just about a murder. It's about a woman consumed by hate and isolation who let her anger spiral into something irreversible. Her case shook the community and left a lasting impression on law enforcement and prison officials. She didn't just commit a crime, she became a symbol of how deep personal rage, if left unchecked, can explode into violence that ruins many lives, including your own. Tina LaSonia Brown, State, Florida. Prison facility, Lowell Correctional Institution, Florida. On the night of March 24, 2010, a brutal act of violence unfolded in Ensley, Florida. 19-year-old Adriana Zimmerman was out driving with two other women when her life took an horrifying turn. Tina LaSonia Brown, her daughter Brittany Miller, and their friend Heather Lee pulled up beside her, dragged her from the car, and launched an unthinkable attack. They beat her with a crowbar, shocked her with a stun gun, and then set her body on fire. After the assault, they fled, leaving Adriana barely clinging to life. She held on for 16 days before dying from the horrific injuries, leaving a community shocked, grieving and demanding justice. Investigators quickly identified the trio responsible. Tina Brown, then 39 years old, was charged with first-degree premeditated murder. Her daughter and friend were also arrested, but faced lesser charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Adriana's body told the story of burn marks, blunt force trauma, and signs of restraint, all matching the weapons and tools found in the suspect's possession. It was clear this wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a calculated, cold act of cruelty that left no room for doubt. During her 2012 trial, the courtroom heard every disturbing detail of what happened to Adriana. Prosecutors laid out the timeline of torture, while Brown's defense pointed to her history of mental illness and drug use. But the jury wasn't swayed. The violence was too extreme, too deliberate. Tina Brown was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to death. In 2024, she officially became the only woman on Florida's death row, a status that still stands. Now housed at Lowell Correctional Institution, Tina Brown's name has become infamous. She's not known for killing many, but for the sheer brutality of that one act. Local headlines dubbed her the Ensley Torture Killer, a title that stuck. Her case keeps coming up in conversations about the death penalty and how we judge women who commit violent crimes. It's not often we hear about women orchestrating such savage acts, but Tina Brown's story stands as a terrifying reminder that evil doesn't come with just one good face. Dorothy Williams. State, Illinois. Prison facility, Logan Correctional Center, Illinois. Between late 1987 and the summer of 1989, Dorothy Williams left a trail of fear through Illinois as she preyed on the elderly, people who never saw her coming. Her victims were 79-year-old Lonnie Laws, who she strangled just before Christmas in 1987, followed by 64-year-old Caesar Zuhl in 1988, who she stabbed to death. Then, in 1989, she killed again, this time 97-year-old Mary Harris, also strangled in her home. All three attacks were tied to robberies, and it wasn't just them. At least 5 other elderly people were robbed during that same period. Dorothy was battling a drug addiction, and the need to feed it pushed her deeper into violence. Police didn't take long to recognize that these weren't isolated incidents. There was a clear pattern where each victim was elderly, attacked in their own home, and robbed. The brutality in each case rang alarms, and when they started putting the pieces together, all signs pointed to Dorothy Williams. She was finally arrested in September 1989, and with the help of forensic evidence and witness accounts, authorities were able to tie her to the murders and other crimes. When her trial came around in March 1991, the courtroom heard it all 3 counts of first-degree murder and several counts of armed robbery. The jury didn't hesitate. Dorothy was sentenced to death, making her one of the very few black women in U.S. history to receive that penalty. Her conviction stirred public debate on how women, especially black women, are treated in capital punishment cases, and how society views female killers who don't fit the mold. Years later, in 2003, Illinois Governor George Ryan commuted all death sentences in the state, including Dorothy's. Her sentence became life without the possibility of parole, and she stayed behind bars at Logan Correctional Center until her death on December 19, 2020. She was 66. Her crimes may not be as well known nationwide, but inside Illinois, her name became synonymous with calculated violence. Dorothy Williams is remembered not just for the number of victims, but for how deeply her crimes cut into the community, thereby making her one of the most chilling female offenders in state history. Roberta Elder, State, Georgia. Prison facility, Georgia Women's Prison, mid-20th century. Roberta Elder was the kind of woman most people wouldn't give a second glance. But behind that quiet exterior, she was silently building one of the deadliest legacies Atlanta had ever seen. It started in the late 1930s when members of her own household began dying mysteriously, which was first a grandchild, then a cousin, later an infant, and even her husband, Reverend William Elder. The pattern was chilling. Every one of them had life insurance policies taken out by Roberta herself. For a while, their deaths went unquestioned, brushed off as bad luck or illness. But as the bodies stacked up, doctors finally took a closer look, and what they found was arsenic. Even with the gruesome nature of the deaths, Roberta's case barely made noise in the mainstream press. While white female killers like Nanny Doss made national headlines, Roberta's crimes were largely ignored by white newspapers. It was the black press that dug into her story, calling attention to the outrageous number of deaths and questioning why no one had stopped her sooner. It took the official coroner's report confirming poisoning to finally push law enforcement into action. Only then did authorities connect the dots and arrest her. Roberta was convicted for her crimes, though details about the length of her sentence and the exact prison where she served are murky. What we do know is that she spent the rest of her life in prison in Georgia, and while she was behind bars, the world moved on. Her case was quietly swept under the rug, her name fading from public conversation, even though she had taken more lives than some of the most notorious women in true crime history. Unlike her white counterparts, Roberta never got the documentaries, the books, or the headlines. Roberta Elder's story isn't just disturbing because of the number of people she killed. It's disturbing because of how quickly her story was erased. She used arsenic the way some use a knife or a gun, methodically and without remorse. She turned her own family into targets for profit, collecting insurance checks while the community looked the other way. We've gone through the lives of women whose names rarely show up in headlines, but whose actions left permanent scars in history. Some of these women used their hands, others used their minds, and a few used both. What connects them isn't just fear or infamy, it's how deeply they disrupted everything we thought we knew about danger, trust, and even the system itself. These stories remind us that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it's quiet, calculated, and wearing a familiar face. But just like history remembers the loudest voices, we also have to remember the ones that were almost erased. Because the most feared women in American prison history didn't just leave behind victims, they left behind lessons.